From the national headquarters of RT America and our nation's capital. Hello again, everybody. Here we are. I'm Rick Sanchez. Tonight, 2 U.S. senators are blasting Russia for denying them visas. But is that what really happened? This is a fascinating story of real high tensions between our two countries. But we're going to begin tonight with something that could affect every single person within the sound of my voice. Yesterday, when the group of 7 nations got together in France, the mood was kind of grim. And much of that has to do with financial fears. For the first time, we actually heard world leaders articulate their concerns for an oncoming global recession. Within the last 24 hours, in fact, Morgan Stanley, one of the largest multinational investment banks in the world, announced that it is downgrading its growth outlook for the first quarter of 2020 from 2.8 to 2.6%. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. It is suggesting that we could be in a recession within 6 months. That's Morgan Stanley saying that. Now, some of the talk of global recession is conjecture. Some of it is political. So what I would like to do on this night is cut to the chase and try and list for you the signs that have many economists concerned, or in some cases convinced. There are 7 of them. Let me take you through them. 1, the Mac Daddy, the escalation of the U.S.-China tariff war that really began about 18 months ago. 2, just last week, for the first time in a decade, the U.S. manufacturing sector showed a significant decline. 3, the recession in Germany has already begun. The economy contracted by a small margin in the second quarter and will contract by an even larger margins in the third. 4, China has a debt crisis. State industries have borrowed heavily, and so have consumers. Banks are weighed down by loans that may never get repaid. 5, the uncertainty of Brexit has already damaged investment and GDP growth throughout Europe. 6, tertiary countries with large economies still are also already in recession or have recently suffered a contraction. Here's the list: Argentina, Iran, South Africa, Turkey, Venezuela. And finally, bond markets, as we've told you here exclusively on this newscast, are extremely jittery. Investors who lend money to the U.S. government via the bond market are actually selling their short-term loans in droves in expectation of an imminent recession, just as they did before the 2008 financial crash. These are the signs to be taken in full or in part. Ignore it, analyze it, accept it. We present it in keeping with the axiom that we believe that information is power. This is the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe it's time to do news again. And here we go. As you've come to expect, our list of the questions that we think you'll be asking tomorrow after watching this newscast tonight. Is a recession inevitable? And what does Ron Paul say about this? Is Russia denying U.S. senators visas? And who started this whole debacle? And that's what it is, say experts. Epstein's victims say, keep investigating. Who goes down if they do? But we kick off our A block tonight with the disturbing economic markers coming out of Europe. Germany, the EU's strongest economy, is almost certainly in the grips of a recession. Not in the future, not next year, right now. RT's Peter Oliver has the story from Berlin.
It would seem the German economy is heading for recession after it contracted by 0.1% in the quarter from April to June. It looks almost certain that there's going to be a second second quarter of contraction in a row, and that officially means you're in a recession. Now, to back up the idea that Germany may be heading that way, we're going to look at the findings of a Munich-based economic think tank, one of the most respected around. They put together an index every year of confidence amongst German businesses, and this time around, well, it's at the lowest it's been for almost 9 years. That's really the manufacturing industry where we've seen that confidence drop off. It's those manufacturers and the products that they export which builds the German economy. It would seem they also have the ability to be able to break it as well. The reason that there is a downturn in confidence amongst these big German companies is, well, two main reasons. One of them is President Donald Trump and his trade wars with China and just about anybody else he can get into a trade war with, and also Brexit and uncertainty over what's going to happen when, if, how Britain ends up, the United Kingdom ends up leaving the European Union. One of the other reasons for this, though, has been the automobile industry. Germany's cars are world famous. They're one of the biggest exports that comes out of the country, but the car industry has been feeling the pinch of late because of two reasons. One of them is that they're still fighting against the stigma and the fallout after getting caught cheating on emissions tests. That is still rumbling on, and certainly it did affect consumer confidence, but it's also potentially still going to end up costing multi-billions with a B in lawsuits. And there's also a problem for the German car manufacturers, is they haven't really handled a move away from the traditional combustion engine towards electric engines very well. They haven't been the global leaders they perhaps would have wanted to be when it comes to that. But when it comes to, are we in recession yet? No. Technically not, and it's certainly what's being said from the economy ministry here in Berlin. Their spokesperson said Germany is not in a recession, but that's pretty much only because we're not through September yet. However, the professor behind the study into business happiness, he said he hasn't seen lower morale or morale at this level since 2009, right at the very peak of the financial crisis. I'll leave you with a quote from him. He said that not a single ray of light was to be seen in any of Germany's key industries. Sleep well, everybody. That is the way it looks at the moment. Not going well on the confidence front. We're not in a recession yet, but that's more of a matter of time than anything else.
Thank you, Peter. We think. Joining us once again on the news here with Rick Sanchez is Dr. Ron Paul, former congressman, presidential candidate, and renowned libertarian, here to try and break down for us the structural weaknesses in the American economy, something we should all be attuned to, and who is likely to suffer most if and when a recession hits. Real wages for the average Chinese worker are up five-fold over the last 20 years. And by real wages, for those who don't know, I know you know, Dr. Paul, is not just how much money you make, but how much you can buy with that money. In other words, if 5 years ago you could only buy 4 apples with your paycheck, but now you can buy 20 apples. Whereas in the United States, real wages have actually gone down. I state that because I'm thinking, who wins this argument, this tariff war that we're having with China? Given that their workers are probably, I don't know, I guess the term would be more satisfied than ours right now, does that make them more apt to be able to outlast us in this war that Mr. Trump is engaging in?
I think a lot of people believe that, and there's a lot of truth to that, because we're looking at a lot of chaos. And I think you touched on something which I consider one of the most serious political problems, and that is the average worker hasn't kept up. The inflation has gone to subsidizing big corporations, big banks, and the welfare state. But and everybody recognizes that prices will go up too. The cost of education goes up, and all these different things, but wages never keep up. They're always, if prices are going up 10%, wages might go up 1%, so there's a lot of resentment. But what I get very annoyed about is people see these discrepancies and see freedom doesn't work, free markets don't work, sound money doesn't work, and all this, and they don't know what they're talking about. It is interventionism that we have. It's not socialism, but it's interventionism, which if you get too much of this partnership between corporations and government, you will end up with a more fascist state, and and that's bipartisan. That's what bothers me. If you look at the medical system, that is a combination of big corporations and government and people who think they're going to get a free medical care, and that is corporatism, and I think it's very, very dangerous because people don't fully understand it, and it's going to lead to something much worse.
I think the concern that I hear from you when you and I were talking, for example, this weekend, is that manipulation on the part of the government often breeds more manipulation on the part of the government. And I think what we see coming down the pike here is that these tariffs, which, as you said, in and of themselves are manipulative on the part of our government, will cause our economy to somehow shrink. It'll cause Wall Street to weird out and panic, which will then cause the Fed to try to fix things for them with another manipulation on top of a manipulation by then decreasing interest rates. So at what point does this kind of stuff stop? And I think that's your concern, right?
Yeah, and I think we're getting pretty close to it, and I've always believed the admonition that if goods and services and people don't cross borders, armies will. And the founders knew that, and that's why they wanted a more free trade and get along with people. But no, I think that there's a blame game going on, more hostility than ever, even though I've only been out of the Congress for 6 years or so. I mean, the language is getting tougher because it's bankrupt. We're bankrupt financially, we're bankrupt morally, and that's why we're heading on a collision course. So all of a sudden you see the popping up of the radical socialists coming and declaring what they know. And then also I think the voices that you don't get to hear much about are the ones you're willing to at least talk with. And that is, maybe there's another system built on property and freedom and getting along and diplomacy and all of these things. And I'm pretty optimistic that that's the way to go. And what we're doing is this animosity is building up, and I think it's going to end. I sort of alluded to it in my program today that we could end up, within a year or so of some major calamity, because I don't think for a minute that we really recovered from the recession of 08 and 09. We just spent a lot of money, and I think there's trillions of dollars in bank reserves. The bank reserves, money left over that they don't know what to do with, is 10 times bigger than what would have been ordinary. And that one rule they changed is they get paid interest on it. So the money is pumped out, and the banks end up holding the most. Then they get paid interest on safe loans. And I don't know about you, Rick, but I still, if I have to have a little cash around for emergencies, if I put it in a CD, I don't get very much interest off it. So it's a system that is very bad. It's doomed to fail. And zero rate interest rates or negative rates, it's total insanity. It's so far removed from an economic policy that makes sense.
That's absolutely crazy. Final thing, and we're down to 10 seconds, so I almost just need a yes or no from you. A lot of people trust your gut on this kind of stuff. Are you convinced at this point that we're heading, probably sometime next year, into a recession?
Oh yeah, I think it started. I think there's enough evidence there. I remember this came up in 07 during one of our debates, and I said, this already started. In 08, they say, oh, okay, we can go back and we can figure out. No, it has started. And besides, I look at this a little bit differently. I look at the people who are suffering, the low middle income people who are working and can't even afford their rent. They've been in recession. They've been in depression. So it's not so easy to say everybody gets, the same kind of treatment. The very wealthy can escape a lot of this punishment, and that just aggravates the political system and causes more anger.
He tells the truth. That's why we have him on. Ron Paul, thank you, my friend. Meanwhile, tonight it appears that the tensions between the United States and Russia are heating up. It's hard to tell if this is a serious diplomatic standoff or a childish game of gotcha. So here, just let me take you through the facts. Once again, it's what we do, right? First, the U.S. Treasury came out with a list of 210 names of people that it doesn't want American or European banks to do business with. The stated reason for including them on this official blacklist: they have connections to President Vladimir Putin. Then, the U.S. Treasury went even further when it announced official sanctions against 17 senior Russian government officials, 7 Russian billionaires, and 12 Russian companies. The reason for the sanctions, according to the Treasury, has to do with, quote, the Russian occupation of Crimea. There's more. Recently in the UK, a Russian billionaire was barred from entering the country. No specific charges or reasons were given. Roman Abramovich then used his Israeli passport to get in anyway, which is now turning into a controversy in and of itself. And finally, now this morning, just this morning, 2 U.S. senators say they have been denied visas to enter Russia. There they are. Democrat Chris Murphy, Republican Ron Johnson blame the Russians for, quote, isolationism, isolating themselves. But the Russian Foreign Ministry is saying the real problem here is that Johnson and Murphy never really applied officially for visas. It also is accusing Johnson of not really looking for dialogue, but rather confrontation. That's how they describe it in Moscow. Joining us now is a geopolitics expert that we like to turn to in situations like this, John Jordan. John, I understand you've been actually reading the headlines, looking into the situation from the Russian perspective. Can you give us, as Americans, the perspective on just how bad and how defrayed this relationship seems to have gotten?
It hasn't been this bad since really towards the end of the Cold War in the early 80s. I'm a Russian speaker, read Russian headlines on a daily basis. The political environment in Russia towards us is as toxic as it is here in America towards Russia. The only thing that Democrats and Republicans can agree on largely is that Russia is bad and China is bad right now. That's the only real area of bipartisan agreement. But it's the same is true in Russia. There's widespread anti-American sentiment throughout Russian society. What's really tragic about this is unnecessary. In the Cold War, at least you could point to a grand struggle between Marxism, Leninism, and freedom. There was an underlying set of themes to the struggle. But now this is just 2 countries, and there isn't a grand ideological contest. It's unfortunate, and I suspect in the decade or so to come, the only real winner is going to be China.
I went to a discussion this weekend with Ron Paul, spoke to some CIA folks, even spoke, interestingly enough, to a lot of Reagan officials, people who were part of the Reagan administration. And they seem to be saying that part of this needless commotion between the United States and Russia has a lot to do with NATO. And the fact that NATO seems to want to constantly overplay the so-called Russian menace. Do you agree with that appraisal?
I agree. I do in large part. I think the origins of this struggle really go back to the end of the Cold War, when NATO expanded eastward with such abandon, not just into the former Warsaw Pact countries, but into parts of the Soviet Union, which had always historically been part of the Russian sphere of influence. When one country is victorious in a great contest, like the Allies were over the Central Powers in World War I, you never rub the loser's nose in it, because that country, even though they may have lost the contest, they're always going to be there. And as a result, we had the Germany collapse and the rise of Hitler. And I'm not comparing Putin to Hitler in any sense, but I'm just saying when you are too hard on a defeated foe and you humiliate them to such an extent, you are sowing the seeds for subsequent conflict. And there was no reason for NATO to expand that far east. And that really laid the groundwork for today's troubles. I mean, at the end of the day, what does America really care if the Russians reconstitute the Russian Empire? I mean, is it really a threat to American national security? But we're paying a price for having encroached onto what for over 1,000 years had been, Russian influenced areas.
I know you have a passion about this, John. I thank you for joining us and taking us through this. We certainly appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Now to the Jeffrey Epstein story and developments there. More than a dozen of his victims showed up at a hearing today in federal court in Manhattan, venting their anger and their outrage. They want to make sure that the Epstein case doesn't die with him. And more importantly, they also want to make sure that the other people that were involved, including the organizers, a specific woman we've told you about before, named Ghislaine Maxwell, and the men who also abused girls, if they did that, they should also be prosecuted, right? RT correspondent John Huddy has followed this story from Miami to the islands and beyond, and he's joining us now for an update. I think it would behoove us to start this discussion with Ghislaine Maxwell. Almost every witness account that anybody has read on this story calls her a recruiter, and some witness accounts go beyond that and say she was actually involved, John, that she was actually part of the abuse of some of these girls. Why is there no movement? Is there an apprehension? Is there investigations? What the hell do we know?
Yeah, that's really a big question, isn't it? Where in the world is Ghislaine Maxwell? And by the way, it's starting to come out, Rick, that the pictures of her at that In-N-Out burger place, that fast food place in Studio City, may have been staged. It may have been a hoax. Which I, to be honest with you, when that came out, I was a little dubious because it looked like it was Photoshopped. So it sounds like that may have been the case, that she may not be in L.A. So where is she? Is she in London? She has a flat in London. We do know that she's basically been in hiding. We haven't seen her. We haven't heard from her. But she remains a key figure in the ongoing Epstein saga and the allegations of sexual abuse, sex trafficking, and even rape against him, with many of the accusers basically telling the same story, that Maxwell was Epstein's chief recruiter of teenage girls and young women who were manipulated into working for Epstein under the guise that they would be, answering phones, helping around his properties, maybe giving him innocent massages occasionally, but ultimately, as we now know, they were forced into, according to the allegations, sexual servitude and sexual abuse by Epstein. Even they're saying Maxwell, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who was at that hearing today, has said Maxwell is a central key figure. And along with, the numerous victims, saying that Epstein's friends and associates and make up that quote-unquote web of connections that you talked about on the show, that we've talked about. But that's they've all been involved. Yeah, go ahead.
But that's the quandary. See, everything that you just said fits everything that most people who followed this case have seen. So let's remove the name Ghislaine Maxwell and say John Huddy or Rick Sanchez or just about anybody else. My suspicion is we would already be in jail. We would already at least be investigated. We would already have been questioned by authorities somewhere. This does not, John, appear to be the case with her. Why?
Well, it's a good question. Yeah, and look, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to start delving into that. But I think it is a good question. Why? Because here's the thing: Maxwell has been, like I said, a key figure, playing a central role in this, and her name continues to be brought up. It's been since 2005 when these allegations were moving forward. All right, and she's denied the accusations against her, but therein lies the question. Has she been questioned by investigators? Have federal agents questioned her? If not, why not? Is something? Are they gonna raid her properties? Are they gonna move forward? I think one thing that we're hearing, Rick, I should mention another figure in this is Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, who's a longtime friend and associate of Epstein's, who even after Epstein's 2008 conviction was still hanging out with him. In 2010, he was at Epstein's house, Manhattan townhouse, which isn't illegal, but it raises questions because Andrew has been said to be involved in these sexual exploits. So now we're hearing that investigators are looking into possible email exchanges between the two to see if there's any incriminating evidence. So I think they are focused on not only Andrew, but Maxwell as well, and how that transpires and how it moves forward really is the big question at this point in the ongoing saga.
John Huddy, man, you got a great handle on this story. Thanks for staying on it. I know a lot of people have written to us and said, look, stay on this, because it just seems too perplexing that this situation is carrying on the way it is. And if they have talked to her, why haven't they told us, right? John Huddy, thank you,
Absolutely.
my friend. Thank you for that report. Tonight we examine the protest in Hong Kong and the protests against the protests as well, because people both in the mainland and in Hong Kong, we were reading this morning, are questioning the protesters' intent, right? RT correspondent Sara Montes has just returned from China, where she covered both the Huawei story for us and the Hong Kong protests. I guess you could say she was pulling double duty while she was there. She's back now to talk about her experiences. First of all, to you as a fellow colleague, job well done.
Thank you.
You did real yeoman's work over there, and we appreciate it. It was a couple of moments. You know, great journalism sometimes is about just paying attention and seeing great moments as they unfold. And there were a couple of them that took place during your reporting. There was one where there was this little old man crying while he was hugging one of the protesters. It seemed clear to me the old man was on one side, the protester was on the other. Amplify that for us.
They were both actually on the same side, the anti-government protest. If you take a look right there, it was a priest hugging from the peaceful rationality camp versus the valiant resistance camp, those who have been a little rowdier, made a little more noise, who have been a little bit more violent. You can see it was a very powerful moment because that day the promotion of that protest was peace. So, and that really showed. They came together, both sides, the peaceful rationality and the valiant resistance, and they showed peace. They marched together. There was no violence, no tear gas, no rubber bullets, nothing of that sort.
So it speaks to the conflict within the conflict.
Correct.
That there are conflicts within the protesters themselves.
Well, and that's the problem, Rick. There is no actual leader, no actual organization or persons really leading this anti-government protest, which is why it's really complicated when we've heard Chief Executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, say that she's ready to start dialogue. But with whom? With what group of people? With what person? Really, it remains to be seen who this will be spoken with.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's a certain opaqueness about this whole contingency, this whole protest. And it came to light in an interview that you did. And I want to play it for the audience. This is a woman who you spoke with who can't seem to be able to nail down why she's even protesting, but her English is impeccable. Here it is.
The bill was not withdrawn. There was no independent investigation. I don't recall the rest of the three precisely, but I'm pretty sure none of them were answered in a constructive way.
She's not sure?
Well, here's the problem, too. I think that a lot of these protesters started on the one demand of the extradition bill. They know that what they're protesting for. They're asking for their freedom of speech because they feel like their freedom is being taken away. And onto that list then created more demands, those 4 additional. So I think a lot of them were there saying, look, we're here for the extradition bill. Whether they know the details as far as the other demands that have been listed, that I think is a little bit unclear, especially because Carrie Lam has said that the bill is dead, but it's the rhetoric. They want complete withdrawal because technically that bill remains on the table.
But if you have demands and you don't have clarity, you have no demands. So, I mean, just saying. Great job. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rick.
And get some rest, will you?
Thank you.
She did great. Hey, thanks so much for being with us. We'll be looking for you again tomorrow, and it'll be time to do news again. See you then.